Well, I went to art school, so I always painted and drew before I joined the army, and I was continued to do that after I left. But I think I started to make more paintings after I was injured, and they didn't say it. Somehow it didn't say enough, so I started to write.
Il y a évidemment des liens très forts entre ce roman et votre vie. Mais c'est pas vous, le personnage s'appelle Tom Barnes, tout est raconté à travers des objets. Est-ce que vous diriez que raconter comme ça une histoire qui est la vôtre, mais avec la distance non seulement de la fiction, mais de ces objets, c'est une manière de littéralement objectiver une expérience et la rendre plus large?
When I started writing, I was looking for a way to remove myself from the story for lots of reasons. One of them was to do with not wanting to be too sentimental about what I was writing about, but also I think it's the same anywhere, but in Britain, my grandmother always talked about her father never talking about the First and Second World War, as if it was you should never pour out your heart. So there was something about the sort of British stiff upper lip going on, where I didn't want to be too sort of emotional about it. And this was a way of the objects. That was the first reason that I used them. But as soon as I started writing, they did lots of other things for the story that were very interesting for me.
Et justement, vous parlez de votre grand-père. Je sais que votre père aussi est militaire, un très très grand soldat. Vous ne mentionnez jamais l'endroit, le terrain de la guerre, même si évidemment on se doute de où ça se passe. Est-ce que c'est une manière aussi de parler, non pas seulement du conflit que vous avez vécu, enfin un des conflits que vous avez vécu, et de parler de la guerre en général et de ce que c'est que d'être un soldat, enfin un militaire, de défendre son pays, de devenir une victime, mais de ne pas vouloir être considéré comme ça non plus, comme une victime?
So I'm very worried. I never want to feel like a victim, firstly. So I suppose there is a lot of that in there. But more importantly, when I started to write, I sort of knew that there was lots of great non-fiction and memoir about Afghanistan. But I didn't want to get sort of bogged down in the facts too much. And I wasn't interested in whether Tony Blair was doing the right thing, or that sort of politics. Because I wanted to write fiction, I wanted it to have some air around the story, so a sort of gap between the real world and this fiction, so it could stand alone and be its own thing, and sort of be truthful to itself, so people can bring what they like to it. But for me as a writer, it was important that I could slightly separate it and talk more generally about conflict. Along with that, although Tom Barnes, the main character of the book, goes through, I sort of put my injuries on him. He also reacts in a very different way. He is fiction, and the characters around him, as you say, my father was in the army, but the characters that surround him during his recovery and when he's in this unnamed conflict are fictional. And then also I described the insurgents as well, and they're obviously fictitious. When I was writing it, although there were experiences that were very close to my own, as soon as I started writing them, it felt like pure fiction. And the objects were a way of, for me, being very creative. So I could wake up in the morning and write from the point of view of a Persian rug that's knotted together and travels across a country. So that was very liberating in that sense. And as soon as I was doing that, it made it even more fictitious. But I understand that it has there's a thread of autobiography and fact that runs through it. But hopefully the fiction tells a better story, makes it more powerful. To me, it felt like writing fiction. I understand you're saying that these objects bring a sort of factual I'm very interested in form, and when I began to write, and I suppose in a way stumbled across this idea, and I wrote the first chapter, which is from the point of view of a tourniquet that saves Tom Barnes's life. as I started to write, and I wrote the IED chapter, I realised that, could this book be read in any order, so that in a way it had been blown apart and then put back together. And I quickly thought, no, I want more control, but the disorientation and the way of unsettling the reader was a way of trying to make them feel what it was like to be a soldier, because you never know where you are or when you're going to be safe, but also someone who's lying in bed in hospital who's been injured, because you're high on drugs and you've been injured and you don't know if you're going to survive or not. And the short, I try to write them as sort of entities, so objects. The chapters, in a sense, are objects in themselves, is what I was trying to do, and hopefully they sum up to the object of the book.
Et donc il y a 45 objets et ils sont des témoins et ils parlent absolument sans émotion. Donc l'émotion vient évidemment d'autre chose. Et ils parlent tous à la première personne. C'est comme si la première personne du personnage était diffractée dans ces premières personnes objectales.
Yes, they're such good questions. I thought about the book, and towards the end, as a sort of self-portrait of myself. So in that sense, it's autobiographical, and it's my way of exploring things. And so the insurgents, Latif and Faradun, are as much me as Tom Barnes is me. I was exploring why people fight and what it means to be in those situations. And so the objects, in that sense, are, as you say, a diffracted voice. And as soon as writing from the point of view of an object is, you suddenly realise that although for me it gave me a lot of things, it meant that you can't give them too much personality or it falls apart. And there were some objects that I wrote, only a couple, that got cut. One was ketamine and it just had too much personality. But I tried to think of them as having different tones rather than personality, because they're not talking, they don't talk, and they don't even think. They just are sort of points of reference in the world, which is really exciting because you can move them around, they can experience in different ways. So.
Et c'est aussi une manière de diffracter l'histoire, parce que les épisodes sont racontés par les points de vue différents d'objets. Il y a cette scène en vélo avec le sac d'engrais, et l'histoire va être racontée aussi par d'autres objets. Même chose évidemment pour la chirurgie. Donc l'histoire, elle progresse à travers ces différents points de vue, très différents sur l'histoire, mais c'est aussi une manière de faire avancer la narration.
I suppose I'm interested in how we remember war, in particular, very traumatic things. So although, I probably could have made more of it, but the objects, because if you're in a firefight in the army and you're in one trench here and another trench here, the two people's memories of it will be so different, and that it keeps coming back, and in your own mind you re-remember things. And so I was interested in that, but also the way in conflict that, certainly in counterinsurgency, when you're embedded in a small area with sort of local people, you get to know them, and actually you're quite connected to people, and those sort of coincidences that happen seem to happen a lot. And so that sort of these objects tie together, that was meant to reflect that sort of side of conflict. I suppose just sort of layering up the story over time was a very exciting way to write for me, because the objects were sort of connected to different people and to different episodes, and by seeing it from the different points of view, it made it more powerful, hopefully.
Dans le livre, donc on a dit que géographiquement il n'y a pas de lieu très précis, même s'il y a des endroits qui sont cités. De la même manière, il n'y a pas d'année. On sait qu'il se passe quelque chose le 15 août, mais pas à l'année. Est-ce que c'est pour faire de ce texte une fable ou une parabole? Pourquoi il y a cet effacement du temps? Parce que le rapport au temps est très particulier. De la même manière, il n'y a pas de linéarité dans le texte. La chronologie est bousculée.
it's probably a bit of arrogance as a writer, trying to lift it out of context now and trying to make it timeless. And again, it sort of let me. It's not a parable for anything, but I was trying to look at conflict in a sort of very general sense, sort of lifted from any context of now or time. I mean, I was very conscious that when we went to Afghanistan, we were sort of trained to understand as much as we could about the local population, and in a sense that was so that we could win, because by understanding them we would better know how to make them be on our side. So that sort of humanises what is the enemy or the local population. But then you get there and bits of metal start flying around and people start getting hurt, and war dehumanises people, and especially if one of your comrades gets injured, it's likely that when you next go out on patrol you'll be more angry, I suppose. But then when I started writing, and I wrote the IED chapter and I had to create characters that built the bomb, you sort of rehumanise them, and you can't write sort of cartoony bad guys. You know, it has to be you rehumanise them in a sense, and so that runs through the book. And I've always felt, from a sort of soldier's point of view, that the people that I was firing at, I actually had quite a lot in common with, whether they were just young men looking for excitement or they had sort of more political or religious aspirations.
Il y a aussi cette conversation incroyable avec un ami, la première fois qu'il reboit une bière, je crois, où il lui dit tu ne comprends rien, tu ne comprends pas, voilà. Et est-ce que c'est aussi une manière de faire comprendre au lecteur, parce que le lecteur est très très présent dans le livre puisqu'il doit tout rassembler, tout. Est-ce que c'est une manière aussi de dire au lecteur, voilà, vous n'avez pas forcément tout compris à l'époque, mais c'était effectivement extrêmement compliqué, et moi-même qui étais dedans, je suis pas sûre de tout.
I mean, I never would say that I wouldn't want the reader to understand it. I suppose it was more, I mean, it's one of those things that is a theme that is autobiographical in a sense, that I never felt angry about it. And in fact, when I felt most angry was when I found out that a British official had sold a story about me to the press. And I realised that, having thought that they should be on my side, there's sort of tabloid press stuff. But anyway, that was the angriest I was, and I felt at that moment I felt more in common with the people who planted the bomb, sort of, than as I did with this person who'd sold the story. That's slightly off. It doesn't matter, but I think I was just trying to sort of disrupt that. What people think of when they think that we go to these places and it's all us and them. And maybe this is a very personal thing for me, and not everyone feels that, but I certainly, when you look at the situations that people are in and their livelihoods and the fact that their houses or compounds, there's no fire engine turns up and there's no sort of existence of the state, and yet we're there telling them that they should believe in the state, and so I just think it's much more complicated than us versus them.
L'histoire, c'est aussi comment on redevient soi, en se découvrant évidemment extrêmement différent, comment on se réhabitue à soi, et comment on retrouve une forme de vie, d'envie de vivre, de légèreté, et il y a cette humanité extraordinaire qui est exprimée dans le livre.
And when I was writing, although I've probably written a war story, I didn't feel like I was writing a war book, for lots of reasons, but one of them is because it's meant to be quite there's a strand of it that's meant to be hopeful, and this is the strand about Tom Barnes's recovery, which is is quite similar to my own. There's a chapter in the book which is from the point of view of a mirror, and it's when he sort of sees himself for the first time, and it's we all think of ourselves differently to when we see ourselves. If somebody takes a photo of us, we go, well, that doesn't look like me, and everyone goes, that's exactly what you look like. And when I see my reflection in one of those big glass walls, and I see the prosthetic legs, I still have a moment of, oh, that's what I look like. And so I was sort of exploring that that sort of sense of self, and how when you're in hospital there's pipes going into you and then you slowly recover and you sort of feel sort of the freedom again of not being constrained by an injury.
Et justement, on a parlé des objets, mais il y a des objets qui tuent, il y a des objets qui sont absolument vitaux, et c'est aussi l'apprentissage d'une vie avec ces objets, puisqu'il y a tout le passage par, alors évidemment, l'hôpital et tous les objets de la chirurgie, puis en réanimation, ce qui permet de survivre, etc. Et puis après, c'est le fauteuil roulant, et puis après, il y a les jambes. Il y a les objets qui tuent, il y a les objets qui aident à vivre, et puis après, il y a l'objet qui permet de redevenir soi, en fait. Et peut-être vraiment soi.
So I think when I started to write from the point of view of objects, it felt, I don't think, I mean maybe it would work with any story, but it felt like it worked well for this story, because when you're a soldier and you go to war, you carry all of your kit, and some of it lets you get close to the enemy and kill them, and some of it protects you. And your body armour, for instance, you sort of sweat into it, and it becomes, in a sense, it has ritual and luck. And so it felt like equipment's so important to the soldier that it worked well with the story, and I could really show some of that intimacy that you have with the stuff around you. But also then when you get blown up and you end up in hospital and there's catheters and breathing tubes and blood bags, they're sort of keeping you alive. And then there's, as you say, the objects that help you recover as well. And the last chapter's from the point of view of these running legs, and it's this sort of sense of complete freedom. And there's always, you know, it's not complete freedom, but it's this sort of, there's that idea that he's overcome. So there's a bit in the book where the character, as you said, says that he wouldn't change what had happened to him. And that's something that I certainly feel. I mean, it goes up and down. It's not, you know, it's not all the time. Sometimes I wake up in the morning and see my prosthetics legs against the wall and think, oh, I put those on this morning, and they're quite uncomfortable. But to me, there's as much a sense of this has happened to me, I've got to sort of overcome it. And that in itself was exciting, and it's, you know, I wouldn't be sitting here if, you know, then it goes back to what you're saying about the sort of the idea of a victim, and in the United Kingdom, through no one's fault, but I think there's a sort of culture of the victim, and we use the victim in order to have leverage against someone who we see as being the person who's caused that, and that's fine. But I think with soldiers, it's not always helpful, and I slightly wanted to show that, you know, I don't feel like a victim, and the character in the book isn't a victim either.
J'aimerais qu'on parle peut-être du titre, parce que Anatomie d'un soldat, ça souligne l'importance du corps, et peut-être que le corps est un objet aussi dans le livre d'abord, et il redevient une personne.
I didn't. When I was serving, I didn't feel that I was an object, because actually being a soldier is, you're surrounded by people and it's all about people, but at the same time you are this sort of object in a very sort of high technology system, radios, drones, aircraft, which is then in this very low tech landscape, and these objects, lots of them have serial numbers, and as a soldier you have a number. So I started the book with that as a very essential way of, I suppose, increasing the abstract nature of the book. I really wanted the book to start like that and then sort of expand. And as the book goes on, he gets called by his name, as you know, his Tom Barnes. There's a bit in the book where Tom Barnes describes being in hospital and being injured like being an actor in a play that he doesn't want to be in. When he goes to hospital, it's so unreal, and this is something that I definitely felt. It's so unreal that you're still being a soldier, you're still trying to sort of, it's just very weird. And then, I mean, training, it was just so odd to then, you know, suddenly be legless, and there are still sometimes moments, and there were when you can't believe you can't actually believe it's happened to you. That's very rare now, but it still seems like something so unreal. Because you, as a soldier, it's never going to happen to you.
Et, on a beaucoup parlé de violence dans ce livre, enfin, on a quand même dit aussi qu'il y a une forme d'espoir, enfin, et de redécouverte de soi, etc. Mais il y a aussi beaucoup d'ironie et beaucoup d'humour. Est-ce que c'est aussi une manière de survivre quand on est dans cet état-là? Parce que tous les soldats dans l'hôpital s'amusent, et rient de ce qui se passe. Est-ce que c'est une forme de... En France, on parle de l'ironie, d'une forme de politesse, du désespoir.
Ouais.
Mais est-ce qu'il y a un peu de ça aussi?
I think definitely. So, I mean, soldiers' humour is... I mean, any group of people who spend a long time together often develop humour, and I think that extended into hospital, but there's also... Because of the situation, there was a sort of whole new range of things that you could try and be funny about, because even sort of there was medical equipment, loss of limbs, and sort of comparing injuries and things. So I think it's definitely it's a sort of coping mechanism when you're in a conflict, but it was afterwards as well. I mean, I hope the book has light touches throughout, even in the sort of some of the darker areas, and just the way the objects are situated and the way they. I mean, some of it. I mean, it is ridiculous, isn't it, to write a book from the point of view of an object? So it's meant. You know, there is. It's sort of. You know, there is some sort of absurdness to it and playfulness, because you know, I woke up in the morning and it's a very serious endeavour, but also I had to be 10 years old again. You know, to reimagine this stuff. So.
Parce qu'à la fin du livre, il finit par dire à un ami, je crois qu'il a battu un record de son hauteur. Assisté par une bombe. Enfin, je veux dire, c'est quand même incroyable d'arriver à finir par dire ce genre de choses. Enfin, c'est inimaginable au tout début, évidemment.
Yes, I mean, I suppose that's one way of making light of something, and whether that's real or or not, I don't know. But I mean, I feel pretty. I don't know. Some people say that you're masking something, but that's not how it feels to me. I wasn't that well read, actually. I mean, I read, but I wasn't read in a sort of serious way. So I suppose commercial fiction. But then when I started writing, I thought, well, I better find out how this is meant to be done. So I sort of picked up Hemingway and things like that. But I love the books of Ian Banks. And especially his sci-fi novels, because I sort of think of this as a sci-fi or a fantasy book as well. Anyway, I know it's not, but the the sort of some of the way it's told and things. So and I love Ali Smith's books. So all sorts really. I'll read anything, but I'm not. I feel like I'm catching up now.
Okay.
I am writing again. And no soldiers are in it, and there's no objects doing the narration.